Welcome to the fourth episode of Facts on the Ground podcast. I'm pleased to have as my guest today George Szamuely, correct?
Szamuely.
How do I pronounce it correctly?
Szamuely.
Szamuely. Okay, thank you. That's something I meant to ask you before we started recording, so that's my bad. So George is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute, and he is also the author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. He makes frequent appearances on overseas media outlets. I've seen you a bunch on Press TV. So George, welcome. Thank you for taking the time.
Me.
So I think the first thing I'd like to talk about or get your perspective on is obviously what everybody's talking about, COVID-19, but particularly in the context of the responses we've seen in the East versus the West, China's response versus the US's response, and I wanted to get your take on that and sort of the misinformation and disinformation in the media that's been surrounding that. So, yeah.
Well, it's a very strange state of affairs, in that nobody knows exactly what is going on. We get very different numbers in very different countries, and nobody is in fact certain how each individual country is counting its cases of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is happening is that we're getting bombarded with one set of numbers, another set of numbers, and we really don't even know whether we're all talking about the same thing. So we have, as you know, deaths attributed to COVID-19. Now, there's a real problem here, which is, are we talking about deaths from COVID-19 virus, or deaths with the COVID-19 virus, or death presumed to be associated with the COVID-19, even though there haven't been any formal tests made for the virus.
Mm-hmm.
So all the things that tends to be bundled together, and we really don't know what is actually going on. So we get the media saying such a number of people have been killed by the virus. Well, we really can't say that, because we have some person who's in his 80s, and he has a serious lung condition, including even lung cancer. He dies. Maybe he tested positive for the virus. Maybe he just exhibited the symptoms associated with the virus. But it is really misleading to then say, well, this person died from the virus.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's causing a great deal of confusion, and why we're all kind of in this sort of state of flux.
Mm-hmm.
The policies that have been adopted by the United States, by most of the European countries, have been drastic, extraordinarily drastic. I mean, we brought the economies to a grinding halt, and we really don't know how the United States and other countries are going to get out of this mess.
Mm-hmm.
And when it has to ask, well, were these measures taken by the United States and others really warranted, given what we know about COVID-19? Because we really aren't talking about the bubonic plague here. We're not talking about the Black Death here.
Right.
And we're not even talking about the sort of the influenza epidemics of, say, 1918 to 1920, which really just hit everybody. I mean, from all ages, whatever. This isn't really happening now, and so we're really in the situation of we don't know what's coming next.
Right.
How are we actually going to get out of this mess? How are we going to get economies moving? And then what happens if people's livelihoods are gone? What happens if people's modest earnings are gone? And so it really is an extraordinary situation.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely unprecedented in my lifetime. Uh, but why is it that you think that, the Chinese response, which seemed pretty efficient, as far as I know, Wuhan is all but back to operating normally. And didn't the Chinese didn't really put the economy first. It wasn't like their priority as it was in the US. And I'm just curious, which approach do you think? I find the Chinese approach more efficient and more necessary, but I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Well, the truth is, we don't know at this stage. I I do take, I'm afraid, the Chinese claims with a pinch of salt, or
Mm,
more than a pinch of salt. They weren't truthful or very forthcoming initially, and their claims now that there are no new cases, I find dubious. Now, maybe that's true. Maybe they are telling the truth. Um, but I'm a little suspicious, and I do think that we should wait a little bit on that, and then when there's actually time for a proper investigation of the situation in China, the situation elsewhere, before we can say, yeah, the Chinese got it right.
hmm
Because it would seem very strange to me that they locked down this province, but only after quite a bit span of time had elapsed. In which case, there must have been an awful lot of people who had traveled from Wuhan to other parts of China, and thus they must have transported the virus with them, just like the people from Wuhan traveled all over the world and took the virus with them. So I find the Chinese claims saying that we're not having any new cases somewhat dubious. But we'll
Right.
see. We have to wait on that. I mean, at the moment, there hasn't really been any proper international investigation by proper epidemiologists, doctors, scientists would have to then investigate as where whether there are new cases, no new cases. At the moment, we just have to we're relying on Chinese claims. So I'm holding off on that.
hmm Yeah, I think I agree with you that it's healthy to take their claims with a hearty dose of skepticism. Um, what do you think about what's your take on the US sort of going for the economy first, trying to save the economy first, basically dropping the interest rates to zero, um, printing more money? It seems like this old school faith in market manipulation, and that's gonna, you know, miraculously wipe out this pandemic. I'm wondering what your take on that is.
I think that's it. It seems to be the same modus operandi as its response to the 2008 crash, which is 0% interest loans for the banks, while the banks themselves can lend out money at interest. So it's basically just a money-making scheme for the banks,
Right.
while they kind of wipe out the assets and savings of others. Um, if we're talking about this huge trillions of dollars of bailout money that the U.S. government is introducing in the economy, not that much of it is actually going into the pockets of ordinary people. In other words, workers who have lost their jobs, small businesses. I mean, there's a lot of talk about oil, the $1,200 check, and so on, but that's only a small part of it. The
Mm,
large of the bulk of this money is going towards the banks, to Wall Street, And it is a way of essentially getting rid of all the crap that is on their books, just as that was the case in 2008. So it is a kind of again the kind of shady money making scheme, and then masquerading as well saving the workers. Well, workers are not going to be saved.
Hmm.
$1,200 isn't going to get you very far. I mean,
No.
you know what prices are in New York,
Hmm.
and as far as one can tell, there are no rent waivers. There are no mortgage waivers. So, in that case, in a couple of months' time, or whenever the economy, everyone will be back to work, the bills will come due, and people suddenly have to pay back rent.
Hmm.
Um, so that hasn't been wiped off the books.
Right.
So it's what is being wiped off the books? All the crap that is on the books of the banks and corporations. So again, the notion that there's some great generosity here on the part of the government, that isn't happening. In
Hmm.
Europe, to a certain extent, that is happening, where people are still being kept on full pay.
Hmm.
Uh, so you basically your money is going to companies and they keep people on full pay. That hasn't been done in the United States. So I think that there's going to be a very serious crisis in the near future, when basically people are not going to be able to pay their bills, and then what happens?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's going to be even more compounded if the quarantine is still in effect and we can't actually get out in the streets and protest what's
Right.
happening. Um, which I think leads me to another point I wanted to ask you about. Um, you briefly touched on the EU's response to
Hmm.
containing the virus. Um, but what do you think the implications of the virus are for social movements like the Gilets Jaunes, for example, who were out every weekend for almost a year, even though the media here stopped covering it after about a week. Um, what do you think the implications are for social movements like that are I find to be very democratic and also um, I think especially with the yellow vest protests, you've seen this sort of realignment and solidarity between activists and workers, and it seems like this pandemic must have stopped that in its tracks to an extent. So yeah, I'm just curious what you think the implications of this virus are on movements like that in the future.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Um, my own feeling would be that it will be a boost for the radical elements because it will reinforce their idea that the governments don't care about them, that the governments had made no preparations for a possible pandemic. Governments had not really taken the proper control of the borders, had not really made any of the provisions to look after its populace. And I think that will just reinforce the idea that people like Macron and his buddies, they only care about the wealthy. And I think that it will definitely be a boost for radical movements and the feeling that, look, I mean, if governments are failing to provide a protection against pandemics, if they're failing to provide adequate hospital care, medical care, all of that, then there is an opportunity for a radical change. And I think that could happen. Now, of course, it's very hard to predict. I predicted that after the 2008 crash, there would be a strong dose of radicalism, and there was to a certain extent, but it didn't last as long, and it wasn't as serious as I thought it would be, because after all, in that case, you had the financiers who actually brought the world economy to a crashing halt, and I thought now there's going to be a reckoning. It didn't take place.
Occupy movement.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. That yes, there were certain movements like the Occupy movement, but they were muffled by a kind of pseudo radical people like Obama, who pretended to be a kind of opposition and a critic and so on. And of course, he wasn't anything of the sort.
Right.
But you never know. But this could indeed spur very powerful radical movements. There may be people saying, well, why weren't there proper medication available? Why weren't there proper medical facilities available? Why are suddenly people dying in this rate? So there was a pandemic, the SARS pandemic. That wasn't so long ago. What have you been doing all these years? I mean, you made no preparation for something that was bound to come again in the near future. So I think that there will be serious questioning, and it may be that the kind of radical movements will demand. Well, I mean, in the case of the United States, a national health system. They're saying, look, private insurance nonsense really isn't working. I mean, it's just it's clearly failing the people. But I think it'll also be in Europe. I mean, Europeans will feel that why is there such a strong element of private enterprise in key areas such as pharmaceuticals? Why is it dominated by these giants? This is a clearly overwhelming human interest, and we just can't let a few profit-making giants dominate this field. So I think that there could well be kind of radical movements along those lines. Maybe either nationalizing the pharmaceutical industry or regulating it very seriously, so really under the thumb of governments, so that these kinds of things don't happen again. I mean, there's a real why did they just simply ship overseas all their manufacturing plants? So the point is that we can't get our hands on any of these things because everything is being manufactured in China. I mean, right. How could this happen? The pharmaceutical giants just simply allowed this to happen, and therefore we got ourselves into this mess whereby our supply chain is in China rather than here at home being Europe or the United States.
Right. So would you agree that what's happening right now with the pandemic is exposing some very serious flaws in capitalism that I think we've all known have been there for a while, but they're really coming to the fore right now? You're seeing it with the market manipulation here. You're seeing it with the unemployment rate, which is skyrocketing. Do you think there's a possibility there that capitalism could be in its death throes in a way?
It's possible. It's always capitalism has a knack of surviving all sorts of crises. It survived the crisis of the Great Depression. It survived the various recessions that have one after another have taken place since the 1970s. It survived the 2008 debacle. So, it has great resilience because there are powerful interests working on its behalf. But you never know. I mean, just because something has always happened in the past, and we think, oh yeah, well, it'll survive this time. I don't know. I mean, because if people become really miserable. We're already very high numbers of unemployed. I mean, we're now going to 22 million unemployment claims since the coronavirus hit.
Hmm.
Uh, People get mad when they start getting hungry. And
Yeah.
if they can't eat, they can't pay their rent, and they're suddenly faced with being thrown out on the streets, they will get angry. And they will get angry at a system that is basically about private profit and from which they get very little benefit. And that's it. I mean, that's ultimately always been the Achilles heel of capitalism, which is um, does the majority of the people feel that they're getting something out of the system? But I feel okay, I'm doing okay, I'm prospering, I'm doing better than I was doing a few years back. Then fine, even if I'm no Bill Gates and I'm no um, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm doing good. But if they feel that no, I'm getting nothing out of the system. In fact, I'm just going from one crisis to another. Then I think there is a real opportunity for radical movements.
Yeah, I agree. And I think more and more people, not just those who would consider themselves leftists or radicals, even my parents, for example, who both voted for Trump, they've 100% come around to the idea, to the necessity of Medicare for all. And, I think that speaks to what you were saying about, when people become fed up enough, uh, they're going to side with, you can call it radical change or humanistic change, whatever you want. But I think, I think that's a good point. Um,
And I think that's a very good example because, this is healthcare, and the people finding, well, this is a healthcare system that I can't afford. That the only people who can afford it are the wealthy, because this wonderful private insurance, yeah, but I've got all this copays, so
mhm.
no, I'm paying this gigantic premium every month, but I have the copays, I have the deductible. What exactly am I getting out of this?
Right.
So oh, but that's socialism. And so Americans have been terrified of the socialism mantra, for years and years. But there'll come a point that would just say, well, so what's wrong with socialism? So why is that so terrible?
Yeah, and it's not like you know, the US needs to, I mean, I'm not saying I'd be against it, but having Medicare for all doesn't mean the US is suddenly going to turn over and become a socialist country, a la Sweden or something. But yeah, there's this very ingrained fear that I think harks back to the Red Scare and the Cold War, where people hear socialism and they equate it with communism falsely, and um, they just say, well, it can never work here. It can never work here because all we've known is this capitalist system. But I think, yeah, I think more people are starting, whatever their political affiliation is, they're starting to wake up to the fact that this system that a lot of us have bought into in so many ways is getting us nowhere. It's
Right.
actually regressive in a lot of ways. Um,
Exactly. All of these supposed great gains that have been made since the 2008 crash, they've all been wiped out. That's all gone. I mean, just like, you snap your finger, just wiped out. Just like the 2008 crash just simply wiped out the gains of the previous 10 years, with all the internet bubble and everything. So everything is just gone. And so, I think there are, people, certainly not socialists, certainly not people on the left who think, well, this system isn't really working for me. Trump won in 2016 because he posed as a radical, and that he was going to shake up the system. And he said we're not going to touch Medicare and so on. And he even suggested, there were times during the campaign he suggested that he was open to some kind of a universal healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
He abandoned all of that after he won the election, there was a radical element to his campaign. So I think that there's kind of a hunger for some sort of change, that this system that we have now cannot go on. And I think I think that the coronavirus situation is indeed could well be a kind of the fuse that lights up.
Yeah, and that puts me in mind of a term the journalist Chris Hedges often references, the interregnum, that we're in the interregnum right now, where we can't go back and we have to go forward, but we can't figure out how to go forward. And the uncertainty of that is frightening. But I also think, as we discussed a little bit before, it may open new conduits to reorganizing our society in more democratic ways. So I wanted to ask you then, I guess it would be a good time, about your take on the U.S. elections, because we had Bernie Sanders here, who was running, what was touted as this revolutionary campaign for months, and then he just folded and went out with a whimper and pretty much gave up this, I think, just vital chance to say, hey, this pandemic is why we need Medicare for all. And that's not even mentioning how weak he was on foreign policy. So I'm wondering if I can get your take on that, if you've been following that at all.
Yeah, sure, of course. Well, I think that's you raise a very important point, and unfortunately, it was entirely predictable from the beginning that that's what Bernie Sanders would do. That he would again bang the drum for we want drastic economic change, where we need to shake up the system. We got to have Medicare for all and so on. But that all that he's really doing is shepherding the sort of the left, the progressive forces into the Democratic mainstream. Mm-hmm. And that there'll come up some point during the campaign when the mainstream candidate will push Bernie aside, and then Bernie will say, yes, this is the most important thing for all of us is to defeat Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And this mainstream Democrat who hasn't thought anything original throughout his life, that's the person. That we must all rally around that person to defeat Donald Trump. He did this in 2016, and he done exactly the same thing this time. And yeah, and I think he's really has let down his followers. But I do think that this was entirely predictable, that this would be the arc of the Bernie Sanders campaign, because this time really, where in 2016 we could say, okay, the DNC kind of rigged the game against him. This time nothing was rigged against him. He was the front runner. He had money. He had the name recognition. He had the status that comes with having run a very commendable campaign 4 years ago. And it was pathetic. He was knocked out by one of the weakest front runners in all of American history. I mean, I can't think of any front runner as terrible as Joe Biden. And Sanders was just simply swept aside by him.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a semi-big story here several weeks ago about the Iowa primary and how supposedly the DNC rigged that against Bernie in favor of Buttigieg. What do you think about that? I mean, I haven't haven't looked at any concrete evidence that points to that. I've listened to a few reports from reputable sources, but
To
do
me,
you do do you completely disagree that the DNC was trying to sabotage him? And I'm not saying this.
I don't disagree with that. I'm sure that they didn't want him, but that shouldn't have been shouldn't have been the end of the story. I mean, keep in mind, look what happened with the Republicans in 2016. I mean, the GOP did not want Donald Trump. I mean, they were ready to do anything to defeat Donald Trump. Trump just won in defiance of the GOP establishment. He just knocked out one establishment figure after another, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. They did try, even all the way up to the convention, to try to stop him. The problem with Sanders was, of course, they would try to stop him. Yeah, that's the way any political system works. The political establishment does not want any kind of an upstart.
Right.
But even if in the Iowa caucuses, I think he came in second. It was a close thing. I mean, he won in New Hampshire. He won in Nevada. Biden came in fourth or fifth in in each of these races. So, I mean, Biden was nowhere, and so the truth is that Sanders did much worse this time than he did in 2016, and that have to say that's up to him. I mean, you'd have to investigate why it was that he did so poorly this time around as compared to 2016. And I don't think you can just simply say, "Oh, it's the Democratic Party establishment." Of course, they didn't want him, but he should have, he should have done better.
Yeah, I agree with you there, and I count myself among one of the early skeptics of Sanders when he was sort of rising this swell, toward the end of last year into this year, and it also puts me in mind of Tulsi Gabbard, who again was not. She didn't have the support base that Bernie Sanders did. She was effectively deleted from the debates. Yes. But then she comes out and decides to not only suspend her campaign but endorse Joe Biden, who voted for a war that she fought in and ostensibly ran against. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's it's I mean, it's understandable that she would suspend her campaign. It's not so understandable why she had to endorse Biden. Waited until everybody had endorsed Biden. She was about the last person to endorse Biden. I think she endorsed him after Obama, so it was already Sanders, then Obama, then Warren. So if Elizabeth Warren can wait till after Obama had weighed in, I'm not quite sure why Tulsi Gabbard couldn't have waited a little bit. There's no real need for it. Why endorse Biden?
Yeah.
And so, and I mean, in her case, it's even more baffling because she's not even running for re-election into Congress. So I can understand if she were running for re-election to Congress, she wants to keep in with the party, the party leaders. She wants all her congressional assignments and so on. But she doesn't even care about that anymore. Whereas Sanders, he does care about all of this. He's part of the Democratic caucus, and I think he likes all the perks that the Democratic Party leaders give him, all the committee assignments and all that. And I think he probably was extremely worried that if he's in any way reluctant to come out full-throatedly for Biden, that he might not get all those plump committee assignments.
Right.
That is part of his thinking. But in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, I don't really understand, because to me, it seems like she's now kind of an independent figure in American politics. So I don't know what was the need for her to endorse Biden.
Yeah, I don't either. I was talking last night. I did an interview with the journalist Max Blumenthal, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and his theory is that Tulsi did it as a kind of fuck you to the Bernie people because apparently she offered her endorsement to the Sanders campaign and they rejected it, and this was her way to sort of spite them, even though it seems like a pretty stupid way to do it. So I don't know. That's Max's theory, but yeah, I can't really think of any other reason why she would do
Yeah.
it.
Um, why would the Sanders people reject her endorsement? I mean, I don't know why. I don't understand why they would reject it.
I don't either. But I suspect it's because if you go to Bernie Sanders' campaign page and you look at his foreign policy platform, it's like poli-sci 101. It's still referring to a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, which is just, if you look at the West Bank, it's physically impossible. It's these pipe dreams, sort of these like liberal pipe dreams, and so I think Tulsi Gabbard, she ran on this anti-forever war platform, and that challenged a lot of this infantile stuff Bernie had in his foreign policy platform. So I think that was probably a big point of rejection too. And then I think, like you were saying, opportunism. He may have felt that if he accepted her endorsement, he'd be ostracized even more by the DNC. But I don't know.
That yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. He's not exactly a profile in courage, so I wouldn't be surprised. No, I mean I think his foreign policy his positions are really terrible. He goes on and on and on about his opposition to the Iraq War. The problem there is that that was already 17, 18 years ago. I mean, we have a new generation of voters for whom this is a distant memory.
Right.
There's no point in talking about something that's already long gone. It's like, what have you done for me lately? He supported the bombing of Libya, and so his positions are really ultimately is that if a Democrat president is waging a war, he's generally for it. If a Republican is doing it, he's against it. Well, that's just not very impressive.
Yeah, and he has a history of that too. If you go back and look at the 1998 Iraq Liberation Act
Yes.
under Clinton, he voted in favor of that. I think that was a unanimous congressional vote, actually. So, yeah, he has a habit.
Yeah, and he was in favor of the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's a good point. I know you've written about this in your book about Yugoslavia, and I wanted to ask you, with regard to these wars that the U.S. is waging essentially all over the world, how much of that do you think spawns from this sort of this idea that developed during the wars, the first Balkan Wars, and then the war in Kosovo between Serbia and Kosovo? How much this idea of this like kind of Samantha Powers idea of I forget what you call it, responsibility to protect.
Responsibility to protect, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect. That's the kind of the Democratic Party, the Democratic wing of the imperialist party.
Mm-hmm.
The Republican wing is like global war on terror, war on Iran, support for Israel. And there's a kind of an overlap between these two positions where they all support NATO expansion. They're all rabidly anti-Russian, and they all think America has a divine right to dominate the world and to use whatever means necessary to dominate the world. So humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, I'm sure, will make a big comeback under a Biden administration, because Biden was, of course, a big supporter of the bombing Yugoslavia in '99, as was Samantha Power. And she, of course, was a big proponent of the Libya operation in 2011. So if the Democrats come back, then the responsibility to protect is going to make a comeback. But the interesting thing is that the foreign policy just doesn't change. It's just that the slogans change.
Right.
So, like, we had the global war on terror with George W. Bush, and then seemingly we made a smooth segue into Obama's responsibility to protect, and nobody really noticed the difference because the policy is the same. It's just that the rhetoric changed.
Yeah, he removed some soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he replaced them with drones to kill American citizens, even.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree. It's new faces, same system.
That's it. So that's why we'll if under a Biden administration suddenly we're back to responsibility to protect, but the policy towards, say, Venezuela, Nicaragua isn't going to change. I mean, Obama was just as hostile to Maduro as Trump is, Obama was as hostile to Syria as Trump is. So there's a few kind of minor adjustments that are made, but it's not as if anyone else would notice.
Yeah. Well, that brings up a good point too. I guess the deterioration of the American electoral system. I'm wondering, I mean, you've lived in New York, but you also live in Hungary. Mm-hmm. So from a European perspective, what do you and a lot of your comrades and colleagues think of? How do you see American electoral politics? Do you see, because I see it as a system that's essentially breaking down. There's really nothing hopeful to look forward to. It's a charade. But I'm wondering how you see it from your vantage point.
Oh, exactly, because we had the 2016 election, which was supposedly a shake-up to the system. No one thought Trump would win. Trump broke the mold. He moved the Republican Party away from free trade, from interventionism, from hostility toward Russia. And so it seems like, well, look, this is a completely new Republican Party, completely new candidate. And then what have we had since then? I mean, I think Trump has made very little essential change. Mm-hmm. In terms of draining the swamp, well, I mean, you can't get more swampy than the people that Trump has surrounded himself with, not to mention his own family, which, again, some kind of a radical populist isn't going to hire his daughter and son-in-law for just about every position imaginable. So, yeah, you got that. And then what's the alternative? The alternative is this creature, Biden, who's been in the Senate since 1972. 1972. That was the year that George McGovern ran for president. That's a long time ago. So he's been there. This is a kind of a pure kind of neoconservative. Nothing whatsoever is to be expected from him. Right. And it is an extraordinary thing. I mean, we had this democratic race where just about everyone and his uncle threw his hat in the ring, and in the end we ended up with Biden.
Yeah.
This person has been around forever. What was the point of this whole race if you're just going to end up with Biden?
Yeah.
So it is an extraordinary situation. And again, you think, well, will there come a point at which people will get fed up, saying, well, we're not really getting what we want from our political leaders. We have election after election, this big change, that big change, and it's always the same thing. Because we've had these big changes before. Remember, we had Jimmy Carter, this peanut farmer from Georgia, one-term governor of Georgia, and came out of nowhere. He's also going to make changes. Of course, he made no changes. And then, we had Bill Clinton again, seemingly, though he's going to make changes. End of the Cold War, there's going to be the peace dividend and so on and so forth. Nothing came of that. So we keep going through these major changes, but nothing really happens.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we'll see now.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to, we'll see what happens as a result of this coronavirus. Will there now be some demand for drastic change? We'll see. I mean, we don't know at this stage, but that's possible.
Yeah, and we don't know at this point either if elections are going to be postponed. Biden was encouraging people to go out and vote amid the spike in coronavirus in this country, and that was, I thought, just very, not just opportunistic, but psychopathic. I don't see this system lasting much longer. I can't. If you ask me what I envision replacing it, I don't know. I think that's something that we'd have to collectively figure out. But this system is obviously, more than decrepit, and it's people are feeling it, and I think the coronavirus is very much highlighting that feeling of kind of bringing to the fore everything that we've known for a while, and but haven't really seen, and now we're seeing it. So
you raise a good point about the election, because what kind of election is there going to be? There isn't going to be a campaign in any meaningful sense. I mean, how are we going to have meetings, the major meetings with lots of people in the audience? I mean, that's not going to happen. What kind of debates are going to take place? There's not going to be debates. I mean, again, there'll be no audience. So this election just may be nothing more than Biden or Trump making appearances to their favored reporters. Trump giving interviews to Sean Hannity, Biden giving interviews to his friends on CNN or MSNBC, and that's it. That'll be the sum and substance of this election. So, it may well be just a year without an election.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I can't predict. I'm wary of predictions, but it's not boding well, I would say, for democracy, whatever democracy is left here in the U.S. But just speaking a little bit more about Biden, I wanted to ask you about his involvement in Ukraine. When I was talking last night to Max, we briefly touched on Biden's involvement in Ukraine and how he's helped turn it into one of the poorest countries, or the poorest country in Europe. He's helped arm neo-Nazi factions in a supposed color revolution. And it seems, everything that the U.S. sort of set into motion there in 2014, correct? That's when Maidan
Yes,
occurred?
yeah.
Yeah, okay. yeah, everything that was set into motion then, we were fed it as this is again like the responsibility to protect, but
Yes.
meanwhile we're sponsoring these neo-Nazi proxies for both U.S. and NATO advantages. And this situation seems to only have gotten worse. I mean, you have the Azov battalion basically incorporated into the Russian, I'm sorry, the Ukrainian government or military. Um, I mean, you're in Hungary, you're closer to Ukraine, obviously, than I am here. Just wondering if you can discuss a little bit, what's been happening there, what you've been hearing.
Well, you're absolutely right in your summary. I mean, what happened in 2014 was a Western-inspired coup. The legal government of Ukraine was overthrown and replaced by the people who had been defeated in the previous election, but whose virtue, as far as the United States and Europe was concerned, was that they were very anti-Russian. So essentially, this was, as far as U.S. was concerned, great. We now have this very anti-Russian government in Kiev, and therefore very useful to NATO, very useful to the United States. But it was nothing short of disastrous for the Ukrainian people. As a result, they lost Crimea because Russia, got very anxious that now they have this rabidly anti-Russian regime in Kiev, and they're going to want to push Russia out of the Black Sea, which is, Crimea was really Russia's access to the Black Sea and therefore access to the Mediterranean. And it provoked the rebellion in the southeast of Ukraine, the heartland of support for the legal government of Ukraine, which is Viktor Yanukovych, and hence the civil war that's been raging since then, since 2014. So this is what Biden has wrought on Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Absolute disaster. Now, when you add to that the corruption that he introduced, I mean, when you think of by getting Hunter Biden a job like that in exactly, that natural gas company,
Mm-hmm.
Earning something like $1 million a year. Now, Ukraine is a very poor country. So if you're extracting $1 million a year, and Hunter Biden's just one, there were other people who were extracting this amount of money. Can you imagine the impoverishment that you're causing in Ukraine as a result? I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, that's just $1 million. Like, countries like Ukraine can't afford to just lose $1 million going into the pockets of people like Hunter Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is an absolute disaster. And all of this money, because these spigots started churning, the IMF spigot, the EU spigot, the US spigot, all got into Ukraine, and Ukrainians didn't benefit one jot from all of that. It all went into the pockets of people like Hunter Biden. So this is what Bidenism is really about. I mean, it's utter absolute corruption. Theft of resources from the purported beneficiaries of Biden's foreign policy, without anything for the Ukrainians. They lost Crimea. They've almost certainly now lost forever the Donbass, and they are miserably impoverished. And what is the United States offering them? Let's just keep the anti-Russian animus going for longer, even though it's an absolutely destructive policy. But that's what the United States is offering Ukraine. It's the worst possible thing.
Yeah, or weapons packages.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. To fight a war that Ukraine cannot win. I mean, it's totally irresponsible. Ukraine cannot win this war against Russia. So by suggesting that, well, let's give Ukraine more arms so they can continue waging the war, they cannot win a war. And if they tried to fight Russia, then it'll be a catastrophic military defeat. I mean, it's totally irresponsible.
Yeah, and what makes it worse too is so my father's Ukrainian, I'm half Ukrainian,
Mhm.
and this we've talked about this a lot, he and I, and one of the points we always hit on is that Ukrainians and Russians, we're essentially sisters and brothers,
Mhm.
and you know these boundaries, these borders that were drawn by people, they don't really separate us. We're sisters and brothers from the same part of the planet, and
Absolutely.
I think that's what's really tragic about all of this. Whether you agree with Russia's annexation or disagree, it's pitting. I'm not saying just Russia's at fault. Ukraine is at fault as well, but it's pitting basically people who are the same and share the same interests against each other for no reason other than imperial machinations.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, it is. I mean, it used to be one country up until 1918. Kiev is the sort of the origin of Russia, and so when you have Russians and Ukrainians really at each other's throat, I mean, it is tragic. It's a horrible situation, and for the United States to foster this is very cynical, but also very short-sighted because it's ultimately Ukraine is a weak ally, and backing Ukraine against Russia is something if you will get the United States nothing because Ukraine cannot win against Russia. So
Mhm.
United States is essentially choosing the losing side, and so it's both a reckless policy and a foolish policy. And sadly, Ukrainians are the ones who suffer as a result.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just going to make it's not these people, the politicians and their apparatchiks who are suffering from what's happening. It's the Ukrainian people, and I've often felt, since this all began in 2014, that Ukraine has been used as a pawn by both the United States and Russia, and I don't think. I think Russia cares about Ukraine and Ukrainians. I think they're just too close geographically and too close communally. I don't think Russia sees Ukraine as a pawn so much as the U.S. does. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think Russia sees Ukraine as part of its sphere. It's part of a not sphere of influence, but it's as part of its sphere. It's part of the sort of the Russian world,
Mhm.
Russia world. Ukraine is which Ukraine is a part. They can certainly be separate political entities, but it's one world. It's a sort of it's a kind of a Russian Slavic world, and I think that's the way Russia sees it. And they see it that in the long run, Ukraine will come to its senses, and Ukraine will see where it belongs, where it belongs to this Russian Slavic world, and all attempts to pretend that it's somehow the easternmost tip of NATO will
Mhm.
just come a cropper. It will fail. So I think Russia thinks kind of in the kind of long-term way that Ukraine will eventually have to realize that this policy that it's been pursuing since 2014 is just suicidal and is not really in conformity with the Ukrainian people's interests, and Ukrainians who do see Russians as brothers essentially.
Yeah, yeah, as kin.
Hmm.
Uh, just going off that point, I'm hoping maybe you could break down the the Russian invasion of Crimea, the occupation of Crimea, because I think this is a point a lot of people um, reference, but they don't know exactly what they're talking about. They don't know the details. Um, and I know you're somebody who's studied this pretty extensively. So, what's your assessment of that? Why did that happen? What were Russia's motivations? I'm even asking for myself because, as much research as I've done on it, I haven't really been able to come to, any sort of conclusion. But I'd like to get your point of view on that.
Well, you have to um, go back to the breakup of the USSR. It was done in a very chaotic way. Um, and a lot of problems were just simply not addressed. And one key problem that remained unaddressed was the status of Crimea. Crimea had been an autonomous province of Russia, and then it was transferred as an autonomous province of Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. Again, this is the way it was done under the communists. I mean, no one actually consulted the people of Crimea where they wanted to be. He just sort of picked it out and dumped it here. Mm-hmm. In that chaotic breakup, all of the sort of the Soviet borders were somehow affirmed and not really renegotiated. But this was clearly something that needed to be addressed. I mean, because Crimea has always historically been a part of Russia, at least for several hundred years. There had been a number of occasions in which the Crimeans moved toward independence from Ukraine and rejoining Russia. Each time they tried to do so, they were threatened with force. And Russia really didn't do anything very much about it. I mean, they just, they let it go, even though, the Crimeans kept wanting to hold a referendum. But, as soon as they threatened to hold a referendum, immediately Ukraine threatened to use force.
Just to ask a quick question based off of that, do you think Crimeans, why do you think they chose to I don't want to say side with Russia, but why would they rather be a part of Russia than Ukraine? Is it economic? Is it social? Is it?
I think that they consider themselves as Russians, not really as part of the Ukraine. I mean, it's only been really a few decades that it was transferred to Ukraine, and it didn't matter so much while it was all part of the USSR because it was just simply an administrative thing. Okay, so the administration is now in Ukraine rather than Russia, but once Ukraine becomes an independent state, Crimea suddenly is a part of this completely different state that it had never really wanted to belong to. But all they said is that, well, we'll have a referendum. And the referendum is something that's guaranteed in the constitution of Crimea, because Crimea has its own separate constitution, because it's an autonomous province, that they could have a referendum. The moment they said they would have a referendum, Ukraine threatened to use force. So Ukraine knew perfectly well that the referendum was going to go against Ukraine. Russia didn't really do anything about this. And just they just shrugged their shoulders and let Ukraine just run with it. In 2014, that coup really triggered alarm in Russia, because now they thought that the next step would be to try to push the Russians out of, because Russia still had their military base there. This was really their Sevastopol was really their base in the Black Sea. And this was the NATO plan all along, to try to push Russia out of the Black Sea. There was no question, in my mind, no question in the Russian mind, that the next step after that coup would be NATO takeover of Sevastopol. I don't think there's any real doubt about that. And I think Russia just moved very quickly to try to append that. But they did it in a constitutional way. They did it via a referendum. The referendum was obviously for rejoining Russia, and that was it. And then Russia took that over. Could you hold on
And
for a second?
oh, sure.
Okay. Hello? Yes, hello. Good. You want to do a test? In 10 minutes. Okay. All right, that's fine. Sure. Thank you. Bye. So kind of have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, I'm
Yeah,
enjoying the
I
conversation.
was planning on doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to get your perspective
Yeah,
on
well,
that.
that was yeah. So I think that was at that moment, but it was done with considerable more legality than say NATO's seizure of Kosovo or the Western powers' recognition of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which were extremely dubious acts according to international law. Russia did follow international law. I mean, they did have a referendum, and ultimately, if you have a referendum, why is there an obligation not to recognize the result of the referendum? You say, well, there's a referendum, you can't possibly recognize it. Why?
Right.
Because Ukraine doesn't like it, because Ukraine's friends don't like it. Well,
Or it's
the prime.
it's a Russian referendum.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like the Western powers are so hypocritical about this. So they only want to recognize those referendum results that go in their favor. I mean, if it doesn't go in their favor, then well, no, that's a violation of international law. So
Right. Yeah. Okay. So then I guess just to wrap up, my last question would be, where do you see, uh, how do you sort of see like the future, like the near future realignment of nation states, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, who seem to be turning more toward the east, toward China and Russia. China, for example, was in Serbia helping to treat the COVID-19 crisis there. Um, do you see more of at least countries who are considered like pariah states, like Iran and Venezuela, even? Do you see them turning more east toward
well,
Russia, China?
I think, I think that there may well be greater friendliness towards Russia, a greater enthusiasm for helping out Iran, which has been really struggling with this COVID-19, and the U.S. maximum pressure campaign, which has been so unfair. The one thing that, again, we don't know at this stage is what the attitude towards China will be. Because if China is deemed as to be responsible for the virus, then there might well be considerable hostility towards China. So I don't know yet how that's going to shake out. I think for Russia, I think this will be good. I think that there'll be positive feelings towards Russia. Russia's been very helpful. But I think China will be a different case because if it seems like the Chinese really knew about this virus, they didn't let the world know about it, and given that we already had the SARS epidemic from 2003, which also originated in China, there may well be a real kind of feeling that enough is enough, and there has to be a reckoning with China. And how that will manifest itself, I suspect, is that there'll be greater pressure on companies to divest from China and to start bringing their manufacturing bases home, both in the U.S. and in Europe.
So sort of a furthering of Trump's trade war, if you will.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's a possibility. But again, there'll also be, I think, hostility towards Trump. So so I think that's I think that's a given that
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're certainly living in uncertain times,
yeah.
what with the virus and what's going to happen with these elections. But George, thank
Right.
you very much for joining
Well,
me. I
thank you.
appreciate it.
I enjoyed our talk immensely.
Yeah, yeah. So George Samuely, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Hmm.
George Szamuely was my guest today on Facts on the Ground. He's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. He's the author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. And he's a very incisive mind on Twitter. You can follow him at George Samuely. And George, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse.
Okay.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. All the best. Okay.
You
Bye-bye.
too.
Bye.